Hello everyone. So welcome to the first lab, and as I've mentioned before, this is going to be quite an experiment for me and for you to some extent. This is the first time I've ever tried doing something like this, so you'll bear with me, I hope, as I go through this. We'll get through this together, but let's be able to laugh at our mistakes, because certainly there will be mistakes as we go through. So the first lab study guide is going to cover the basics. We're going to introduce ourselves to some basic anatomical terms, some directional terms, body planes, overview of organ systems, body cavities, and serous membranes. So this is the basic overview of what we're going to cover in this lesson. We'll cover these things. As you look further down the lab study guide, you'll notice that there is a list of things that you should know once we've completed this lab. So you'll know all of this information, and you can look at this list yourself. You have this or should have this as we're going through this, and you're looking over and following my presentation. So all of these things are what we're going to cover today. So we'll start off with looking at anatomical terms, and then we'll move into directional terms, and then we'll look at things called body planes and sections. We'll do a very brief overview of organ systems, very, very brief. Body cavities and something called serous membranes, which I'll explain to you in just a bit as we get into that material. And then this is a more detailed list of the things that you should be familiar with once we're done with this lab. Okay? As you know, this material is being supported by Virtual Body, which there is a link in my my Canvas shell, and you can click on that, and you can review most of this information that we're covering today. All right, so let's begin. So we're going to start talking about the human body, and to talk about the human body accurately, which is a very important thing to do, we have to have a common frame of reference. In other words, when I mention the human body and talk about a particular part of the human body in relationship to another part of the human body, I want to be able to talk to you about that, and you and I both have the same idea of what I'm talking about. In other words, there's no miscommunication as we talk about these things. In order to do that, we have to have a common frame of reference. What is the human body going to look like when we talk about it in a medical setting or in this class? And this picture demonstrates what that looks like. So what it's called is correct anatomical position. And as you can see, a human body in correct anatomical position is facing you. They have their arms to the side, palms facing out, feet slightly apart, and their feet flat on the ground. So this is called correct anatomical position. Now, when I talk about the human body, and you think about the human body as I talk about it, this is the picture that should be in your mind. And what this allows us to do is to have this common frame of reference. For example, when I talk about the thumb being lateral to the little finger, you can agree with me because we've agreed in the first place that this is the way the human body is. And here's the thumb. There's the little finger. This is lateral. This is medial. And I can make that statement. The thumb is lateral to the little finger. And you and I can agree on that because we have this common frame of reference. The other thing I want to mention is when you do talk about the human body and you talk about left and right, it's not your left and right. It's the patient's left and right, or the model's left or right, or in this case, the picture that we're looking at, left and right, not yours. So one way to think about this, it's not about you, it's about your patients. So when you talk about a patient, you talk about their left, their right, not your left and your right. And as long as we agree on those ground rules, then we can start to talk about the human body more accurately to one another. So let's begin and take a look at the structures that we're going to identify and learn. And you'll have to do this on your own. I'm going to go through them and I'm going to point them out. But in the end, you're going to have to sit down and just memorize this material. And I haven't given you a lot. There's many more regions, body regions, that, as you can see on the drawing that we just looked at, that are identified and named. I have limited that list to just what you see here. So we're going to talk about the skull or cranial region, the face or facial, optic, buccal, nasal, occipital, mental, orbital, and oral. Now all of those are found on the head or cephalic. So if we look at this drawing here, and we focus in on the upper part of the body. So first of all, we'll talk about the head. So the head or cephalic region, that includes everything that sits on the neck. That's the entire round object that sits on the neck. And that entire round object is divided into two major parts: the cranial or skull and the face or facial. Now obviously, when we talk about face or facial, you know what we're talking about. It's all of this part right here, including the eyes, the nose, and the ears, and the mouth, and all of this. That would be what we consider the facial region. The rest of it, which is, you can see even behind here, all of that, which holds the brain, that's the cranial region of the larger thing that we call the head. Now, the facial part is divided into distinct regions itself. So if we look at our list, starting at the top of that list, we have the skull. We talked about that. The optic, which refers to the ear. The buccal, or buccal, which is the cheek. Nasal, nose. Oral, mouth. And mental, the chin. So those are the areas that you're responsible for being able to identify and name. Okay. As we move down, we're going to talk about what connects the head or cephalic region of the body to the trunk. And that, of course, is the neck or cervical region. So that's the narrow part that connects this larger structure, which we call the trunk, to the head. That's the neck. Okay? As we move into the trunk, you will see it's divided into distinct regions. So we have this region up here. We're not going to include the arms in this discussion. Those are different parts of the human body. We'll talk about those later. What we're referring to now is simply the trunk, which includes all of this area right here, not including the arms, not including the legs. So what we're looking at is the upper part. This whole trunk is divided into this upper region, which is called the chest or thoracic region, and the middle region, which is called the abdominal or abdomen, and the pelvis or pelvic region. Now, separation of those areas, as you can see on the drawing, is done by these dotted lines. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, your body doesn't have those dotted lines. So what are we referring to? What is this all about? Well, these are landmarks, and mostly they're interior landmarks. So the exterior part is not clearly defined, but interiorly it is. So if for this upper dotted line, what we're going to use is a muscle called the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped muscle that roughly corresponds to this line right here. And that muscle separates this area, the chest or thoracic area, from this area, the abdominal or the abdomen region. And I do have a drawing, I think, that will help us see that more clearly. So here is a drawing. So that dotted line basically corresponds to this right here, which is the diaphragm. And everything above that is the thoracic region of the trunk. Okay. So the next dotted line, which is this dotted line right here, represents the edge of the hip bones. So the hip bones are sitting right here, and they form the joint that where the leg is attached to the trunk. And if we place a plane across the top of those bones, this line represents that plane. So that separates then this region, which is the pelvic region or pelvis, from this region, the abdominal abdomen. Okay. Now, you can also see that we have a couple of other structures that are part of the trunk. So, for example, there's the coccyx, or coxal, and hip. That's literally the hip of your. There's inguinal, or groin, which is basically, you can think of that as the crease where the leg and the pelvis come together. And then there's the pubic, or pubis, which is where the genitalia, the male and female genitalia, are found. Now, one thing I want to point out to you is that the pubic or pubis sounds an awful lot like pelvic or pelvis. So here again, this is where we have to be very careful with language so that we can communicate accurately. These two terms sound very similar to each other, but they're very different. So this is an area where we find the genitalia, and this is a larger area that sits below this dotted line. That's part of the trunk. Okay. On the posterior side, if we look here on the posterior side, we have back, loin, buttocks, and scapular. Now let's begin with the scapular. That's pretty easy. That's located above the bone, the scapula, and it's this region of the body right here, the shoulder blade as it's commonly called. Okay. The next region is the loin, and as you can see, what we're talking about with the loin is, oh gosh, where is it? Where do they point out the loin here? Oh, that's the lumbar area. Of course, there it is. So it's this area right here. Basically, that would be the lumbar or loin, and then the buttocks or gluteal area is this region here. So this is again very much like the anterior part of the body. This is divided into three areas. So the dorsal, the lumbar, and the buttocks or gluteal region. Okay. What else? So let's talk about the upper limb, which is, of course, what you call the arm. The arm is divided into the upper arm and the lower arm. The upper arm is the brachial region, so this is all the brachial region. And the lower arm is the antebrachial, the opposite of the brachial. So that's the antebrachial. Where the underarm joins, or I should say, where the arm joins the trunk, underneath that joint is an area called the axillary or armpit. Right. What else? Carpal refers to the wrist, so that's where you would call the wrist is the carpal. And then the phalanges are the digits, so those are your fingers, including the thumb. Those are all going to be referred to as the phalanges. And the pollex is just a fancy word for thumb. Okay. The lower limb includes the femoral region, which is the upper leg. Okay. The patellar region, which is the knee. And then the curial, which is the lower leg. And then we have some terms. Dorsum, which is the top of the foot, where your shoelaces are found. Calcaneal, which you can see from the posterior view. So calcaneal is the heel. So this area right here is the calcaneal region. Plantar is the bottom of the foot. So that's what you plant on the ground. That's the part of the foot that sits or comes into contact with the ground. That's the plantar. And then hallux is another fancy word describing the large toe. Okay. So all of those are body parts or regions that you should be familiar with. Now let's talk about dividing the body or creating directional terms. So here are the directional terms that we will need to learn. And as you can see, they are actually paired up. So in other words, lateral and medial are a pair of terms. They mean opposite things, but they're connected. We'll see how that works in a bit. Contralateral, ipsilateral, again, these are paired up. Proximal and distal, again, paired up. Superior, inferior, paired. Superficial and deep, again, paired. Anterior and posterior. Now here, I want to point out something. So anterior and ventral, these two terms in the human body are synonymous. They basically mean the same thing. But technically, that is not true. And I will show you in just a minute how that works. Same thing with posterior and dorsal. So in the human body, these two regions coincide. but in a four-legged animal, they would not. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then, of course, we've already talked about this, the cephalic, cranial, or the head. Okay, so let's take a look at what these terms mean, and we'll do them in pairs. As I said, they are paired up. So here is a nice drawing that will allow us to identify these different parts of the body. Okay, so lateral and medial. The first thing we want to do is we want to imagine a midline that separates or divides the body right down the center into an even left and right part of the body. Okay, so that's what we're going to call our midline. Now, when we talk about medial, we're talking about an object that's closer to the midline. Lateral is further away from the midline. So in this drawing, we can identify, for example, the sternum is as medial as you can get. It's right in the middle of the body, and the arms are more lateral to that structure. Another example, the eyes, and let's take a look at the picture so we can identify that. We take a look at the eyes, and we compare them, to example, to the ears. The eyes are more medial than the ears, okay? And the ears are more lateral than the eyes. Let's take a look at the hand. Here we talked about this earlier. This is why I said the thumb is more lateral, or is lateral to the little finger, because it's out here further away from midline. This is closer to the midline. Okay, so that's medial and lateral. The next two terms are contralateral and ipsilateral. Contralateral and ipsilateral. And as you can see, contralateral are structures on the opposite side of the body. Contra meaning opposite. And ipsilateral structures on the same side of the body. So if we look at, say, the arms are contralateral, the legs are contralateral, the eyes are contralateral, the ears are contralateral, but the left arm and the right and the left leg are ipsilateral. So those are examples of how those two terms are used. Okay. Proximal and distal. So proximal and distal, what we're doing here is we're generally talking about a limb, and generally it's the arm, not so much the leg, but the arm. So we start with the point of attachment, and that is the most proximal position of the arm. So this is proximal, and way out here is distal. So if I compare the elbow to the wrist, what I'm saying is that the elbow is more proximal than the wrist, or the elbow is proximal to the wrist. Okay. I can say that the shoulder, or the head of the humerus, is the proximal end of this bone, and the end of the humerus that forms the elbow joint is the more distal end of that bone. I could say that the wrists are distal to the fingers. Okay? So that is how we use that. Now there's another way in which proximal and distal gets used. And here, what we want to do is we want to look at a tube. And there are plenty of tubes in the human body. And we have a beginning and we have an end. So let's say this is the small intestine. So this is where it's connected to the stomach. And this is where it's attached to the large intestine. So this is a tube, starts at the stomach, ends at the large intestine. And since this is the beginning, we call this the proximal end, and this would be the distal end. So any tube of the human body, when we look at it, we identify the beginning of that tube as the proximal end, and the end of that tube as the distal end. So that's how that terminology is used when we're describing positions in the body in reference to some sort of tube that we find in the body. Okay. So superior, inferior. Here, what we're referencing is the ground and the sky, basically. So, and these terms, these terminology, superior, inferior, are used primarily in the trunk, head, and neck region, and also in the leg. So the arm, we're going to use proximal and distal. With the leg, we can use superior and inferior, and the trunk. So the closer you are to the head, the more superior you are. The closer you are to the feet, the more inferior you are. So the head is superior to the neck, whereas the neck is superior to the trunk, whereas the legs are inferior to the trunk. So that's how that terminology is used. Superficial and deep. Superficial and deep. So here we're looking at these two terms right here, superficial and deep. Superficial means closer to the surface. Deep, it means further away from the surface. And these two terms are used to describe body parts of organs or even of the body where you have a three-dimensional volume and you're describing the relationship through that three-dimensional volume or shape. So, for example, with the human body, the skin is superficial to the muscles, whereas the muscles are deep to the skin. If you're looking at the heart, the surface of the heart would be more superficial, and the deeper you go, of course, for example, the chambers of the heart would be deep to the surface of the heart. Okay. Let's talk about anterior and posterior. Okay. And let's come back to those terms. I'll bring them up again so we can look at them. Anterior and posterior, and we're going to connect ventral and dorsal to those two terms. Now, let's take a look at how all of this works out. Okay, so I'm going to draw Fido. This is your dog at home if you have a dog. Yeah, I know it's bad, but bear with me. And Fido has a kind of weird tail, but we can deal with that. Okay, so there's Fido, and here is the ground. Okay, Fido's got a weird nose, huh? All right, so that's our dog, and let's identify different regions on this dog. So this is going to be anterior. This is going to be posterior. This is going to be dorsal. And this is going to be ventral. Now, that's a four-legged animal, and that's the orientation. Those are the parts. So anterior is the first thing that you see as your dog is walking towards you. It's the head part. And posterior is the last thing you see as the dog walks away from you. So that's the back end where the tail is. And then its back is dorsal and its belly is ventral. Okay? So this is true for all four-legged animals. But now let's take a look at the caretaker of this animal. Okay? And here he is. He looks kind of unhappy. I suppose he's been stuck inside too long. And that's why he needs exercise. He's got too much going on, too much food coming in here. Okay, so there he is. All right. Oh, we got to give him some hair. There you go. Oh, missing an ear. There you go. All right. So there is the gentleman that takes care of this dog. And let's identify the belly or ventral. Here it is, ventral. All right, there's the belly. Here's the back, dorsal. But what's the first thing that you see as this gentleman walks towards you? It's this part right here. So that's my anterior. And then this is the last thing as he walks away. And that's your posterior. So when we stood up on two legs, we changed the orientation of the back and the ventral to anterior and posterior. They became the same thing. That's my belly, that's my anterior. That's the back, or dorsal, and posterior. Okay. So this is only true, these two terms are synonymous. Anterior and ventral are synonymous only because we're standing on two legs. Same with dorsal and posterior. They're synonymous only because we're standing on two legs. Okay. All right, so that is why when you look at that list, they are clumped together. So anterior and ventral are the same thing, even though technically they are different things. And posterior and dorsal, again, technically different, but we combine them together because we're talking about the human body. And we've already mentioned the cephalic, or the head. Okay. All right, let's go on and talk about planes and sections. Okay. So planes and sections. When we want to look inside the human body or look inside an organ, we're going to have to cut it. We're going to have to open it up, and we're going to have to look on the inside. And we have two terms here, planes and sections. Why are there two terms, and are they different? And the answer is yes, they are different, and we have two of them because they're describing two different situations. For the purposes of this class, and only for the purposes of this class, we're going to treat these two names, planes and sections, as if they were the same thing. First of all, let me explain the difference. So, in this drawing right here, at the top, here's the human brain. And you'll notice that this is referred to as a plane, and this is being referred to as a section. What's the difference? The difference is this has been cut, and this is only an imaginary cut through that structure called the brain. Right? So a plane, if you will, is an imaginary line or cut through a body or through some organ in some particular orientation. Whereas a section it's a completed cut. You've already done it. As I said, what we're going to do in this class is we're going to treat those two terms as if they were the same. So here, in this drawing right here, we're going to go through and identify the various planes or sections that you will need to know. Okay? So frontal plane. A frontal plane is going to divide the body into an anterior and posterior part. Or, if we divide an organ into an anterior and posterior part. Doesn't matter. It could be the entire body. It could be one of the organs in the body. But if at the end of cutting it, we have a part that's anterior and a part that's posterior, then that's a frontal plane. It's also sometimes referred to as a coronal plane. As you can see in your study guide, coronal plane. So that's another term that means the same thing as frontal plane. Divides the body into anterior and posterior sections. Transverse plane. This is going to be basically a cut through the body. In this case, it's going to be parallel to the ground. And it divides the body into a superior-inferior part. Same is true with a organ. If we divide the brain so that we end up with a part that's at the top part, the superior, another part that's inferior, that's then a transverse plane. It can also be called a cross-section or horizontal plane. Cross-section, I'm going to explain in just a bit. It's a little bit different, but often transverse plane, cross-section are used as the same thing. So, parasagittal and sagittal, parasagittal and mid-sagittal. All right, so remember what we talked about with the human body. We have a mid-line, an imaginary line that divides the body right down the center into an equal left and right half. So if we cut the body on that line and split it in half, that would be called a mid-sagittal plane or section. And that's what we've done here. We've divided the brain into a left and right half, equal halves, and that would be a mid-sagittal. So it's a very specific cut. It's right down the center, equal halves. Okay. A parasagittal plane is off-center. It could be off-center to the left, could be off-center to the right. We don't know until we actually look at it. How much is it off-center? We don't know until we actually look at it. So it's a much more nebulous much more lessly defined kind of cut. It's what we do know is it's not right in the center, because if it was right in the center, that would be called a mid-sagittal plane. So it's off center, left or right, don't know. How much? We don't know. It's off center. Okay, so that's your parasagittal. And the last one that is on this drawing anyway is the oblique. An oblique plane, which is not, to be honest, very often used. It's fairly rare, and I don't think there's any image in your textbook that has an oblique plane, but we'll become familiar with it. You might run into it in your studies as you go along. So an oblique plane is any plane that's not a horizontal plane, that is not a transverse plane. It's at some angle other than straight up and down or horizontal. It's at some angle. Do we know how much angle? No, it's just an angle, oblique. All right. All right, I want to talk a little bit about longitudinal section and cross section. And I'm going to do this by way of a drawing. So let's do this. So I'm going to imagine now a tube. All right. And what I want to do is I want to cut this tube in this fashion right here. So I'm going to cut it like this. I'm going to cut it through that. And then I'm going to split it in half, and I'm going to rotate it. So I'm going to get this. When I'm done with that, I will see this view of that tube. Okay. This is a cross section. So that's one way of opening up that tube and looking on the inside. There's another way. I can cut it the long way, along the longitudinal axis of this tube. Okay. Oh, let's do this. There you go. Okay. And when I do that, what I get, if I extend that out, what I'm going to get is something that looks like this. Okay, I'm going to get this. That is a longitudinal section. That's my longitudinal section. All right. So if we were talking about the small intestine, and I wanted to look at it in one particular way, I'd say take a cross section, and this is what I would get. If I want to take a longitudinal section, that's what I would get. Okay. All right. So, what else do we got? Take a look at our study guide. All right. Let's take a look at body cavities, and we'll save the organ systems for the end. Take a look at body cavities, and we're going to look at how the body is divided up into different spaces interiorly. And I'm missing a drawing here. I'm back here. Yeah. All right. So turns out that the body is not a solid object. There's actually spaces inside your body. And that's kind of counterintuitive. You would think that your body is all solid inside, but it's not. It's got spaces. And those spaces are divided into two major spaces, and then and each of those major spaces is divided into smaller subsections, or smaller spaces or cavities. Okay? Let's start with the dorsal body cavity. The dorsal body cavity. All right. We already know what we mean when we say dorsal. We're talking about the back. So I have a big space right here where the brain sits, And then there's a long, thin canal that extends from the brain down through the spinal column. That's a space too. It's filled with the spinal cord. So these two spaces together, the cranial cavity and what they're calling the vertebral canal or vertebral cavity, that's the dorsal body cavity because it's on the back side. Then there's the ventral body cavity, and that's this space right here. So this is the space in the front of the body, and that includes the thoracic cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. So those are the two major spaces. The dorsal body cavity, which includes these two spaces here, so that's your dorsal body cavity. And then the ventral body cavity, which includes the blue area and this area, the green area. So if we were to divide that here, this is my dorsal body cavity, and this is my ventral body cavity from here to here. And this is the dorsal body cavity. Okay? Now, as I mentioned already, the dorsal body cavity is subdivided into the cranial cavity, where the brain is found, and the vertebral canal or cavity, which is where the spinal cord is found. Okay. The ventral body cavity is a little bit more complex because there's a number of spaces that are included in that part of the body. So first of all, we have the thoracic body cavity here in blue. And then below that, we have this very large cavity here. This is called the abdominal pelvic cavity. Right? So in blue is the thoracic cavity, and in green is the abdominal pelvic cavity. So if you look carefully at that word, abdominal pelvic, you'll see that there's two terms, abdominal and pelvic. So we can subdivide this space into the abdominal cavity, which is above that dotted line. We ran into that dotted line before, didn't we? Let's see if I can find that other image. Come back to that. Here it is. So remember these dotted lines? Okay. Remember how we divided the outside of the body, the thoracic region and the abdominal region and then the pelvic region? We're doing the same thing inside. In fact, we're using the same exact landmarks to make that division. Okay. So if we come back here, you see that I have a very large space here. That's your thoracic cavity here. This is my diaphragm. So again, remember that's the landmark we'd used earlier. So everything above the diaphragm, that space is the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm is the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then we're going to divide the abdominal pelvic cavity with two smaller spaces, the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And we have that second dotted line. And remember, that is produced by having a plane that sits on top of the hip bones, and that produces that space called the pelvic cavity below the edge of the hip, the upper edge of the hip bones. Is this space right here? Okay, and you can see the various organs that are contained in each of those spaces. Okay. The thoracic cavity is subdivided, and to see that, a better image to see that is right here. Okay. So we're going to divide the thoracic cavity now into a number of smaller spaces. Again, we identify the diaphragm. So down here is the abdominal pelvic cavity. And this is our thoracic cavity. And it includes a space for the lungs, here and here, a space for the heart, and a space between the lungs, which is shown by this dotted line right here. So the space that the lungs occupy is the pleural cavity. So this would be the right pleural cavity right here. That's where the lungs occupy that space. And on the left side, the same thing. We have the left pleural cavity. Okay. In the center, between the lungs, is called the mediastinum or mediastinal cavity. And that includes a smaller space within it called the pericardial cavity. Okay. So, have you seen those Russian nesting dolls where you have the big doll inside is a smaller doll, inside that one is a smaller doll, blah, 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 keeps going on. Well, this is a very similar setup. So we have the very large space, which is the thoracic cavity. Then we have a smaller space, the mediastinal cavity. And then inside that is a smaller space, pericardial cavity. And if we wanted to expand that idea, we could say the thoracic cavity is part of the ventral body cavity. And then that's found, and then the thoracic cavity is found inside that ventral body cavity. The mediastinal cavity is found inside the thoracic cavity. And the pericardial cavity is found inside the mediastinal cavity. So nested one inside the other. So those are the cavities. Now, let's talk about serous membranes. So what is a serous membrane? A serous membrane is a thin layer of cells, connective tissue and cells, that acts like a wrapping. It's like the wrapping on a Christmas present. Or it's like what happens when you take food and wrap it in saran wrap. That thin layer of saran wrap is the serous membrane. And I'm through a series of drawings, I'm going to kind of give you how all of this works, kind of to give you the background that allows us to see and understand the relationship of the various layers of the serous membrane. So I'm going to use some colored pencils now, and we're going to start off, and we're going to imagine that we're right at the beginning of the development of the human body, and we have some body cavity. And it doesn't really matter too much what body cavity we're talking about. It's empty. There's no organs in it now. But we want to grow an organ. We want to create an organ. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start making that organ. Now, to make that organ, we have to have cells, obviously. We have to have some cells that are going to differentiate. Well, there is nothing here to build on. So where are we going to get those cells? We're going to get it here in the wall of this empty cavity. And there's going to be a set of cells that begin to differentiate, to grow, and to start moving off in a different direction than all the surrounding cells. And that's going to be eventually some organ. Okay? We don't have to talk about what organ it is. So this applies to many different situations in the human body. Now, lining, by the way, lining this cavity is a membrane. And that membrane is going to be shown right here. So this is the membrane. So here is our membrane. Okay. And this is going to be what's going to be the organ. Okay. And this is my body cavity. Okay. Now, as time goes on, things are beginning to change. And what's going to happen is we're going to see a growth in this area. We're going to see things beginning to really start to take off now, a lot of cell division, and we're going to see now that this is actually growing. Doesn't quite look like an organ that we can recognize at this point, but it's all happening. Look at, it's all happening underneath that membrane. And as time continues some more, this will develop even further. And it's really beginning to take shape now. It's still connected to the wall. But it's pushing out. Look, see, it's pulling, it's pushing out into that empty space, which is the cavity. But it's still sitting behind that membrane. And as time goes on, this thing is now much more developed. And finally, we get to the completed structure, the completed organ. And here it is. Let's just imagine that this is the liver. And now I'm going to change up the colors a little bit because I want to identify separate parts of the membrane. So here, and notice now that what we see surrounding the membrane or surrounding the organ is this. There we go. Okay. Because of this developmental pattern, where we begin with the developing organ in the wall behind the membrane, as it continues to develop, it's pushing out. As it pushes out, it pushes the membrane with it, and finally, it's sitting where it's supposed to in the mature human body. And this was part of the wall here, but now because the organ is pushed out, it's sitting around the organ. We still have part of the membrane. It's one continuous membrane that surrounds the cavity or lines the cavity, but there's two parts to it now. One that surrounds the organ and one that surrounds the wall of the cavity. And these two things are referred to as separate things because they are found in different places. So the part that's connected to the wall of the cavity is the parietal. Layer. And the part that's connected to the organ is the visceral layer. This kind of motif, this kind of design process, if you will, happens a lot in the human body. A lot. And so this is a very critical thing that you have to understand because we'll be talking about parietal layers, visceral layers. We'll talk about a serous membrane. This is all the serous membrane. So let's come back and look at that drawing of the thoracic cavity. And let's identify some of these membranes, okay? So this process we've just drawn out has happened to the lungs and it happened to the heart. So we have a layer sitting on the lungs. That's this layer right here. And that's going to be called the visceral layer. We have the outer layer that surrounds the space that the lungs sit in, and that's the parietal layer. Okay. Now, because it's the lungs, we attach this term, pleura. So we have parietal pleura and visceral pleura. It's the same thing as we drew here, the visceral layer and the parietal layer. But now, because we're talking about a very specific organ, the lungs, we identify that as the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. The same is true with the heart. So this blue area here represents the actual heart itself, and sitting on top of the surface of the heart is a thin membrane. It's a serous membrane. That's the visceral layer. And then the cavity in which the heart sits, that is lined with a layer, and that's called the parietal layer. And because it is the heart, we're referring to the heart, it's the pericardium. So it's the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. Going back to our image, if this, in fact, was the heart, then this layer would be the visceral pericardium, and this layer would be the parietal pericardium. So that's a very quick overview of the serous membranes and how they are arranged inside the body. One last thing I want to point out in terms of the membranes is that inside the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have a special name for the serous membrane, and that's called the peritoneum. And I'm looking for that. Here it is. So this is what we covered, the serous membrane. We compose two layers, the visceral layer, which is the inner layer, covers the organ. The parietal layer is the outer layer, covers or lines the body cavities. And then within certain body cavities, serous membranes have special names. With the lungs, it's the pleura. With the heart, it's the pericardium. And the abdominal pelvic cavity, it's called the peritoneum. So we don't make a distinction here with different organs inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. So it's all the peritoneum. Okay. So, and that concludes this part or this first lab presentation. And we will have a Zoom conference to go over this together as a class. Each lab will have its own Zoom conference. And if you have questions about what we've talked about here, that would be the time to bring them up. The next lab, we're going to be looking at homeostasis, osmosis, transport across a membrane, and related ideas like that. Thank you.